Dorothy Williams pressed the end call button on her iPhone and set it down beside her morning coffee with hands that had started shaking before she fully understood why. The automated voice from Chase Bank had been perfectly polite, perfectly professional, and perfectly devastating. Your account ending in 4127 has been flagged for suspicious activity. Please contact customer service immediately. She'd been banking with Chase for 37 years. The same branch on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, where she'd opened her first account in 1987, when she became the first black loan officer at Boston Trust. The same bank where she'd deposited every paycheck, every bonus, every careful investment return that had built her into a woman worth $2.3 million at age 71. The same bank where her daughter Keisha had power of attorney since Dorothy's hip surgery 6 weeks ago. Dorothy reached for the phone again, fingers finding the familiar numbers. When the customer service representative came on the line, her voice carried that particular cadence Dorothy had perfected over 4 decades in predominantly white professional spaces. Crisp consonants, careful grammar, nothing that could be dismissed or misunderstood. This is Dorothy Williams. I received a notification about suspicious activity on my account ending in 4127. One moment, please, Mrs. Williams. A pause filled with keyboard clicking. I see here that there have been several large transfers over the past 3 weeks. Let me pull up the details for you. Dorothy's coffee grew cold as the representative read off a list of transactions she'd never authorized. $50,000 to Prestige Property Management, $75,000 to Elite Senior Care Services, $25,000 to something called Compassionate Transitions Legal Group. Ma'am, these transfers were all authorized using your power of attorney documentation on file. What power of attorney documentation? Another pause. The paperwork filed by your daughter, Keisha Williams Davis, showing you've been diagnosed with early-stage dementia and are no longer capable of managing your financial affairs. The words hit Dorothy like ice water. She set down her reading glasses and walked to the window of her Roxbury condo, looking out at the street where she'd lived for 20 years. The neighborhood had been changing. Young white families moving in, long-time black residents moving out or dying off. But her building had been her anchor, her security. Ma'am, are you still there? I'm here. Dorothy's voice sounded strange to her own ears. Could you please repeat what you just said about a dementia diagnosis? According to the medical documentation on file, you've been showing signs of cognitive decline and confusion. The power of attorney was granted to protect your assets during this difficult time. Dorothy had never been diagnosed with dementia. Her last physical 3 months ago had been perfect. Dr. Martinez had actually complimented her on her sharp memory and quick thinking. She still balanced her own checkbook, still played bridge twice a week with her church sisters, still helped her granddaughter with calculus homework. I need copies of all documentation filed with my account, today. I'll need to verify your identity first, Mrs. Williams. Can you tell me your mother's maiden name? Jackson. The word came out automatically, then stopped her cold. Her mother's maiden name was Patterson. Jackson was what she'd told Keisha to use for security questions because it was the name on her great-grandmother's freedom papers, the ones Dorothy kept in her safety deposit box. The ones only Keisha knew about. I'm sorry, Mrs. Williams, that's not the answer we have on file. I'll need to schedule an in-person appointment for identity verification. Dorothy ended the call and stood in her living room surrounded by evidence of a life carefully built. Her Howard University diploma on the wall, photos from the March on Washington, where she'd stood with her parents as a teenager, her late husband's military medals from Vietnam, her daughter's law school graduation picture. Keisha had been so helpful after the hip surgery, bringing groceries, organizing Dorothy's medications, handling the insurance paperwork, always asking questions about Dorothy's accounts, her will, her trust fund, always suggesting that Dorothy should simplify her finances, maybe consolidate everything under one management service. Always filming their conversations on her phone, saying she wanted to capture Mama's wisdom for the grandchildren. Dorothy walked to her bedroom and pulled out the small fireproof safe hidden behind her winter coats. Inside were copies of all her important documents, the real ones. Her will signed just 8 months ago, leaving everything to a combination of family and Howard University. Her medical records showing perfect cognitive function, her power of attorney document that specifically stated it would only take effect if she was medically incapacitated by 2 independent physicians. None of the documents in her safe matched what Chase Bank apparently had on file. Her doorbell rang. Dorothy looked through the peephole and saw 2 people she didn't recognize. A white woman in an expensive suit and a black man wearing scrubs with a hospital ID badge. The woman held an official-looking folder. "Mrs. Williams, my name is Patricia Morrison from Adult Protective Services. We've received reports of concern about your welfare." Through the door, Dorothy could hear her upstairs neighbor's television playing The Price is Right too loudly, just like every morning for the past 3 years. She could smell Mrs. Rodriguez's café con leche from the apartment next door. Everything was exactly as it had been an hour ago, except everything had changed. "What kind of reports?" "Your daughter filed a petition expressing concern about your ability to live independently. She's provided medical documentation suggesting you've been showing signs of confusion and memory loss." Dorothy's legs felt unsteady. She sat down on the small chair by her front door, the one she used for putting on shoes. "Mrs. Williams, we'd like to come in and do a welfare check, just to make sure you're safe and properly cared for." Through the peephole, Dorothy watched the woman check her watch impatiently. The man in scrubs was holding what looked like a medical bag. This was happening too fast, too coordinated, too professional. "Do you have a warrant?" "We don't need a warrant for a welfare check, Mrs. Williams. We're here to help." Dorothy thought about her daughter's law degree from Harvard, her son-in-law Marcus, who worked in hospital administration, her granddaughter Aisha, who was supposed to be studying pre-med at Spelman, but had been asking suspicious questions about inheritance planning at Sunday dinner last month. "I'm not letting you in without a warrant and my lawyer present." The woman's voice changed, losing its artificial warmth. "Mrs. Williams, if you don't cooperate with this welfare check, we'll have to assume you're not capable of making rational decisions about your own safety." Dorothy pressed her back against the door and reached for her cell phone. But before she could dial, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Multiple people coming up to her second-floor apartment. Her own daughter's voice calling out cheerfully, "Mama, I brought some people to help you. Just open the door and let us take care of everything." Keisha had a key. Dorothy had given it to her after the surgery, thinking her daughter would use it to bring groceries and check on her recovery. The key turned in the lock. Dorothy Williams, who had survived Jim Crow, integrated workplaces, and 40 years of fighting for respect in rooms that didn't want her there, realized she was about to fight the biggest battle of her life. And her enemy was the daughter she'd raised to be everything Dorothy had never been allowed to become. The key turned, but Dorothy was already moving. 40 years of navigating hostile corporate environments had taught her that when people came to take your power, you didn't wait around to negotiate. She grabbed her purse, her phone, and the fireproof box containing her real documents, then headed straight for her bedroom window. The fire escape outside had been painted over so many times it looked more decorative than functional, but Dorothy had tested it monthly since moving in. Being a black woman living alone meant having exit strategies. "Mama," Keisha's voice carried through the apartment, artificially bright. "Where are you? These nice people just want to talk." Dorothy climbed through the window onto the metal platform, her hip protesting but holding. 2 flights down was the alley behind the building where Mrs. Rodriguez from 1B parked her catering van. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been watching Dorothy's back since the day she moved in, who understood what it meant to be a woman of color, navigating systems designed to exploit you. As Dorothy climbed down, she could hear voices in her apartment growing more urgent. Her front door slamming. Footsteps moving through rooms. She reached the alley just as Mrs. Rodriguez was loading empanadas into her van for the lunch rush. "Dorothy, Mrs. Rodriguez looked up in surprise. "What's wrong, mija?" "I need help. They're trying to steal everything." Mrs. Rodriguez didn't ask who they were. She opened the van's passenger door. "Get in." As they drove away, Dorothy could see 3 people on her fire escape, looking down at the alley. One of them was definitely Keisha Phone, pressed to her ear, speaking rapidly. "Where to?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked. Dorothy thought about her options. Her lawyer's office, but Keisha probably had connections there through her own legal network. Her bank, but they'd already been compromised. Her church, but Pastor Williams had been asking strange questions lately about Dorothy's estate planning and whether she'd considered leaving a bequest to the building fund. Union Baptist, Dorothy said finally, but not the main entrance, the community center entrance on Warren Street. Union Baptist had been Dorothy's church home for 25 years, but more importantly, it was where Sister Clara Johnson ran the senior assistance program. Sister Clara, who had worked for the NAACP for 30 years before retiring. Sister Clara, who had a network of connections throughout Boston's Black community and a healthy suspicion of white people bearing official paperwork. They pulled up to the community center just as the morning senior activities were starting. Dorothy could see familiar faces through the windows, her bridge partners, her book club members, people who had known her for decades and could vouch for her mental state. "Sister Dorothy." Clara Johnson emerged from the building carrying a box of supplies for the food pantry. She was a small woman in her 70s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Child, you look like you've seen a ghost." "I think I'm about to become one." Dorothy explained everything while Clara listened without interruption. The bank account, the fake power of attorney, the people at her door claiming she was mentally incompetent. "And your daughter is behind this." "My daughter, my son-in-law, probably my granddaughter too. They've been planning this for months, maybe longer." Clara set down her box and pulled out her phone. "First thing we need to do is document your mental state right now, officially." She called Dr. Patricia Williams, not the white Dr. Williams who was the pastor, but Dr. Patricia Williams, who ran the community health clinic and had been giving Dorothy her checkups for 15 years. "Pat, it's Clara. I need you to do an emergency cognitive assessment on Dorothy Williams. Someone's claiming she has dementia, and we both know that's nonsense." Within an hour, Dorothy was sitting in the clinic, taking every cognitive test Dr. Williams could administer. Memory recall, spatial reasoning, problem solving, executive function. She passed every test with scores that would make someone 50 years younger proud. "Your mind is sharp as a tack, Dorothy," Dr. Williams said, printing out the results. "I'll document everything and file it with the state medical board today. But we need to figure out who's been forging medical documents in my name." That's when Clara made her second phone call to her nephew Jerome, who worked for the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. "Jerome, your Aunt Clara needs a favor." Special Agent Jerome Johnson arrived at the clinic that afternoon, looking like he could be anyone's college-aged grandson, which Dorothy realized was probably exactly the point. "Mrs. Williams, what you're describing sounds like a sophisticated elder financial abuse operation. These things are usually bigger than one family." Jerome pulled out a tablet and started taking notes. "Tell me about everyone who's had access to your financial information since your surgery." Dorothy made a list. Keisha and Marcus, obviously. Dr. Martinez, who had handled her hip surgery. The home health aide who had helped with her recovery. The woman from the insurance company who had processed her claims. The lawyer who had updated her will last year. "This lawyer," Jerome said, looking up from his notes. "Gloria Patterson, you said she came highly recommended." "By Keisha. Said she specialized in estate planning for professional Black women." Jerome and Clara exchanged looks. "What?" Dorothy asked. "Gloria Patterson has been on our radar for 6 months," Jerome said carefully. "She's part of a network that targets elderly people of color, particularly those with substantial assets and family members who might be motivated by financial gain." Dorothy felt something cold settle in her stomach. "How many families?" "At least 12 that we can prove. All elderly, all financially well off, all with relatives who suddenly became very concerned about their mental competence. Clara was shaking her head. And let me guess, they all ended up having their assets transferred to their families before dying in convenient accidents. 7 deaths in the past 18 months, all ruled natural or accidental. Dorothy thought about the man in scrubs who had been at her door that morning, the medical bag he'd been carrying. They weren't planning to put me in a nursing home, were they? Jerome's expression was grim. Mrs. Williams, I think they were planning to make sure you didn't leave your apartment alive. That evening, Dorothy sat in Clara's living room surrounded by documents, photos, and evidence of a conspiracy that went far beyond her daughter's greed. Jerome had spent the afternoon making calls, pulling records, connecting dots. So, Gloria Patterson runs the legal side, he explained, spreading photos across Clara's coffee table. She identifies targets, creates fake medical documentation files, fraudulent power of attorney papers, but she doesn't work alone. He pointed to a surveillance photo of a white woman in an expensive suit. Dr. Amanda Walsh runs a private practice that specializes in cognitive assessments for elderly patients. She provides the medical justification for incompetence claims. Another photo. Marcus Thompson. Wait, is this your son-in-law? Dorothy nodded, recognizing Marcus despite his attempt to look professional in the photo. He works for Commonwealth Medical Services. They provide specialized care for elderly patients with cognitive issues. Translation, they oversee the final stage of the operation. Which is what exactly? Jerome pulled out a folder marked confidential. Medication overdoses designed to look like accidents. Usually insulin or blood pressure medication, quick, quiet, and unless someone specifically looks for it, undetectable. Dorothy stared at the photos of her son-in-law, the man who had married her daughter, who brought her flowers on Mother's Day, who had been asking detailed questions about her medical history during every family dinner for the past year. How long have they been planning this? Based on the financial records we've pulled, at least 18 months. They started positioning themselves after your husband died when they realized how much your estate was worth. Clara stood up and walked to her kitchen window, looking out at the street. So what do? We can't just let them keep murdering our elders. We build a case, Jerome said, but we need more evidence, and we need to make sure Dorothy stays safe while we gather it. Dorothy looked around Clara's comfortable living room, at the photos of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, at the evidence of a life well lived and protected by a community that cared. I'm not going into hiding, she said firmly. I'm 71 years old. I've been fighting systems designed to destroy me since before you were born. And I'll be damned if I let my own daughter succeed where Jim Crow failed. She picked up her phone and dialed Keisha's number. Mama, Keisha's voice was tight with concern. Where are you? We've been looking everywhere. You missed your appointment with the social worker. I've been thinking about what you said, baby, about me needing help managing my affairs. A pause. Dorothy could almost hear the wheels turning in her daughter's mind. Oh, Mama, I'm so glad. We were just worried about you. I want to meet tomorrow. You, Marcus, and that lawyer you recommended. I think it's time I faced the truth about my situation. Another pause. Longer this time. Are you sure, Mama, this is a big decision? I'm sure, but I want to meet somewhere comfortable. Somewhere I feel safe. Of course. Where would you like to meet? Dorothy smiled, looking at Jerome and Clara. How about your house 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon? I'll bring the documents they need to see. After she hung up, Clara shook her head. Child, what are you planning? Jerome was already making notes. We'll wire you for sound, have surveillance in place, and coordinate with multiple agencies. If this goes wrong, it won't go wrong, Dorothy interrupted. Because for once in this operation, they won't be the smartest people in the room. The next morning, Dorothy sat in a downtown FBI office getting fitted with recording equipment while Jerome coordinated with what seemed like half the federal law enforcement agencies in New England. The wire is voice-activated, Agent Sarah Chen explained, adjusting the tiny device taped to Dorothy's chest. And we'll have audio surveillance from 3 different sources plus video from across the street. Dorothy studied her reflection in the small mirror Agent Chen held up. She looked like herself, a well-dressed 71-year-old woman preparing for an important meeting. Nothing in her appearance suggested she was wearing federal recording equipment, or that this meeting might result in multiple arrests. "What if they search me?" "They won't," Jerome said with confidence. "They think you're a confused elderly woman coming to sign papers. They're not expecting resistance." Agent Chen pulled out a folder of documents. "These are the papers they'll be expecting you to sign. We've prepared fake versions that look authentic but won't actually transfer any of your assets. Sign these and nothing changes legally, but they'll think they've won." Dorothy flipped through the papers. Power of attorney documents. A new will, leaving everything to Keisha and Marcus. Medical release forms giving them authority to make healthcare decisions. Financial management agreements. "They've thought of everything," she murmured. "That's what makes them dangerous," Jerome agreed. "This isn't their first time." At 1 o'clock, Dorothy sat in the back of an unmarked FBI van parked 3 blocks from Keisha's house in Newton. The neighborhood was exactly what she'd expected when her daughter and son-in-law had bought the house 5 years ago. Large colonial homes, perfectly manicured lawns, the kind of place where Dorothy would have been followed by security if she'd walked through alone. "We have eyes on the house," Agent Chen's voice came through Dorothy's earpiece. 3 cars in the driveway. Your daughter's BMW, your son-in-law's Mercedes, and a white Lexus registered to Gloria Patterson. Dorothy checked her watch. 1:55. "Remember," Jerome said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're playing a role. Confused, maybe a little scared, definitely overwhelmed. Let them think they're controlling the situation." Dorothy smiled. "Honey, I've been playing roles my whole life. The trick is remembering who you really are underneath." She walked up the driveway of the house she'd helped her daughter buy, past the garden she'd helped plant to the front door, where her own granddaughter had taken her first steps. But as she rang the doorbell, Dorothy was thinking about 7 elderly people who had died in the past 18 months and how many more would die if she didn't end this today. Keisha opened the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mama, I'm so glad you came." Dorothy let herself be led into the living room where Marcus was setting up papers on the coffee table, and a white woman in an expensive suit was reviewing documents. "Mrs. Williams." The woman stood and extended her hand. "I'm Gloria Patterson. Your daughter has told me so much about you." Dorothy accepted the handshake, noting how Gloria's grip lingered, how her eyes assessed Dorothy's appearance, her demeanor looking for signs of the confusion they'd been documenting. "Please sit down," Marcus said, gesturing to the armchair positioned directly across from the sofa, where all 3 of them would sit. Dorothy realized they'd arranged the seating to put her in the position of a defendant facing judges. She sat down slowly, letting her movements suggest uncertainty and age-related stiffness. "Now, Mrs. Williams," Gloria began, opening her folder. "I understand you've been having some concerns about managing your finances." "I've been confused," Dorothy said, making her voice smaller, older. "Since the surgery, things have been difficult." Keisha leaned forward with practiced concern. "We know, Mama. That's why we want to help." Gloria spread documents across the coffee table. "These papers will allow your daughter and son-in-law to handle your financial affairs, ensuring that your assets are properly managed and protected." Dorothy looked at the papers, then back at Gloria. "What if I change my mind later?" "Oh, Mrs. Williams." Gloria's voice carried a tone of gentle condescension. "These arrangements are designed to be permanent. Once we establish that you need assistance with decision-making, it becomes very difficult to reverse that determination. Because of the dementia diagnosis." Marcus cleared his throat. "The medical evidence is quite clear, Dorothy. Dr. Walsh's assessment shows significant cognitive decline." Dorothy looked confused. "I don't remember meeting with any Dr. Walsh." "That's exactly the kind of memory issue we're concerned about," Keisha said smoothly. Gloria pulled out a pen. "Let's start with the power of attorney documents. This will allow Keisha and Marcus to access your accounts immediately to ensure your bills are paid and your investments are properly managed." Dorothy took the pen with slightly trembling hands. A tremor caused by anger, not age, but she let them interpret it as they wished. Will I still be able to live in my own apartment? The three of them exchanged quick glances. For now, Marcus said. But eventually, you might be more comfortable in a specialized care facility. What kind of care facility? One that can provide round-the-clock medical supervision, Gloria explained. Given your declining health and cognitive issues, it's really the safest option. Dorothy signed the first document, then looked up with carefully crafted bewilderment. I'm sorry, what were we talking about? Perfect. Let them think she was fading in real time. The next document, Gloria said patiently, is your updated will. This ensures that your assets will be distributed according to your wishes. Dorothy scanned the will, noting how it left everything to Keisha and Marcus with specific provisions for any future medical care expenses. The language was designed to justify large expenditures from her estate before her death. Future medical care. End-of-life care can be very expensive, Marcus explained. This protects your assets while ensuring you receive the best possible treatment. What kind of treatment, Dorothy wanted to ask, but she just nodded and signed. The final document was a medical directive giving Keisha and Marcus authority to make healthcare decisions, including end-of-life decisions. This is standard for anyone with cognitive decline, Gloria assured her. It just ensures that if you're unable to communicate your wishes, your family can make the best decisions for your comfort and dignity. Dorothy stared at the paper. This was the document that would allow them to kill her legally, to authorize the medication errors or complications that would end her life while her family collected insurance payouts and inheritance distributions. She signed it. Wonderful. Gloria collected all the papers, reviewing each signature. Mrs. Williams, you've made excellent decisions today. Your family will take very good care of you. Dorothy looked around the room at these three people who had spent 18 months planning her murder, who had just convinced her to sign her own death warrant, who were probably already planning which medications would be involved in her accident. When will this all take effect? She asked. Immediately, Marcus said. We'll file these papers this afternoon, and by tomorrow morning we'll have full authority over your accounts and medical care. That's so fast. It needs to be, Keisha said, reaching over to pat Dorothy's hand. The longer we wait, the more confused you might become. Gloria was packing up her briefcase, her work here finished. Mrs. Williams, I want you to know that your family loves you very much. Everything they're doing is in your best interest. Dorothy nodded, playing her role to the end. I just want to go home now. All this paperwork is making me tired. Of course, Marcus stood up. I'll drive you back to your apartment. Actually, Dorothy said, I think I'd like to walk. The fresh air might clear my head. Another exchange of glances. They didn't want her wandering around unsupervised, but they also couldn't insist on controlling her movements until the papers were officially filed. Are you sure that's safe? Keisha asked. It's only a few miles. I've been walking these streets longer than you've been alive. Dorothy stood up and gathered her purse, moving slowly enough to suggest fatigue, but not so slowly as to require assistance. At the front door, she turned back to face all three of them. Thank you for taking care of everything. I don't know what I would do without family. We love you, Mama, Keisha said. And for just a moment, Dorothy heard an echo of the little girl who used to braid Dorothy's hair and promised to take care of her when she got old. But that little girl was gone, replaced by a woman who had just spent an hour convincing her mother to sign documents authorizing her own murder. Dorothy walked down the driveway and onto the sidewalk, feeling the weight of the recording equipment against her chest and the presence of FBI surveillance teams positioned throughout the neighborhood. She'd given them everything they wanted. Perfect recordings of their conspiracy, documented proof of their intent to commit elder abuse, and murder evidence of a criminal operation that had already killed 7 people. But as she reached the corner and saw Jerome's unmarked car waiting to pick her up, Dorothy realized the hardest part wasn't over. The hardest part would be living with the knowledge that the daughter she'd raised, the granddaughter she'd loved, the son-in-law she'd welcomed into her family, had looked her in the eye and convinced her to authorize her own death. Some betrayals were too deep for justice to heal. But justice was still worth pursuing, because somewhere in Boston tonight, There were other elderly people being targeted by Gloria Patterson's network, other families being torn apart by greed, other daughters planning their mother's murders. Dorothy Williams might not be able to fix her own family, but she could make damn sure they didn't destroy anyone else's. At 6:30 the next morning, Dorothy sat in a control room, watching live surveillance feeds of 3 different locations. Gloria Patterson's law office, where she was arriving early to file Dorothy's papers. Keisha and Marcus's house, where they were having coffee and presumably celebrating their success. And Commonwealth Medical Services, where Dr. Amanda Walsh was reviewing what she thought was Dorothy Williams's case file. All 3 locations are active, Agent Chen reported. Patterson just accessed the state legal database to file the power of attorney documents. Jerome pointed to another screen. Walsh is on the phone with someone. We're picking up her side of the conversation. Through the speakers, Dorothy could hear Dr. Walsh's voice. Yes, the paperwork is all in order. Mrs. Williams signed everything yesterday afternoon. We can proceed with the next phase immediately. Dorothy felt a chill. The next phase meant her death probably within days. Your daughter and son-in-law are moving too, Agent Chen said, indicating their screen. They just left the house together heading toward downtown. Bank, Dorothy asked. Most likely. With those power of attorney documents filed, they'll want to access your accounts as quickly as possible. The plan was simple. Let each part of the conspiracy proceed until they committed crimes that could be proven in court, then arrest all of them simultaneously. But as Dorothy watched her daughter driving toward her bank, she realized she needed to see this confrontation firsthand. I want to be there when they try to access my accounts. That's not safe, Jerome protested. If they see you, they won't see me, but I need to watch this happen. An hour later, Dorothy sat in the back of a surveillance van parked across from Chase Bank, watching through one-way windows as Keisha and Marcus approached the main entrance. They looked confident, successful, like a professional couple handling routine financial business. Agent Chen was monitoring communications from inside the bank. Branch manager's office. They're presenting the power of attorney documents now. Dorothy could see through the bank's windows into the manager's office where Keisha was speaking animatedly, gesturing toward paperwork. Marcus sat beside her, nodding seriously. The manager is asking about verification procedures, Agent Chen reported. He wants to call Mrs. Williams directly to confirm the arrangements. Dorothy smiled grimly. They're about to hit their first obstacle. She'd called the bank the night before and specifically instructed them that any power of attorney documents should be verified through a callback to her personal attorney, not to her directly. A simple security measure that would complicate their timeline. On the surveillance monitor, Dorothy could see the bank manager making a phone call while Keisha and Marcus waited. Their body language was shifting from confident to concerned. He's calling the number listed for your attorney, Agent Chen said, which connects to our field office. The plan was working. Instead of reaching Dorothy's real attorney, the bank would reach an FBI agent posing as a legal representative who would delay approval for 24 hours pending additional documentation. Dorothy watched her daughter's face change as the bank manager explained the delay. Keisha leaned forward, clearly arguing, her professional demeanor slipping. Marcus joined the conversation, both of them becoming more aggressive. They're pushing back hard, Agent Chen observed. This isn't going according to their schedule. Dorothy's earpiece crackled with Jerome's voice from another location. We just intercepted a call from Gloria Patterson to someone identified as the cleaner. She's accelerating the timeline. Dorothy felt her stomach drop. What does that mean? It means they've decided they can't wait for the financial access to be approved. They're moving directly to the elimination phase. Through her window, Dorothy could see Keisha and Marcus leaving the bank, both of them on their phones, speaking rapidly. Their body language screamed frustration and urgency. Where are they going now? Agent Chen checked her monitoring equipment. Back toward Newton, but they're making another stop first. Commonwealth Medical Services. Within minutes, Dorothy was watching from a new surveillance position as her daughter and son-in-law entered the medical building where Dr. Walsh had her practice. This building specialized in elderly care, providing what they advertised as comprehensive geriatric services. Including Dorothy now understood services that weren't limited to keeping elderly patients alive. "We're picking up conversation from inside," Agent Chen said, adjusting her equipment. Dr. Walsh's voice came through clearly. "The financial delays are problematic, but not insurmountable. We can proceed with the medical intervention as planned." Marcus's voice, "How quickly?" 24 hours. "We'll arrange for a home visit to assess Mrs. Williams' medication needs. A simple adjustment to her blood pressure medication should be sufficient." Dorothy's hands clenched into fists. They were discussing her murder with the casual professionalism of planning a routine house call. Keisha's voice harder than Dorothy had ever heard it, "And there won't be any questions afterward." "Dr. Walsh. Elderly woman, recent surgery history of medical complications. These things happen. The death certificate will list natural causes." Dorothy had heard enough. She pulled off her headphones and looked at Jerome. "I want to confront them now. We need more evidence. We need to catch them in the act of... They just confessed to planning my murder in the next 24 hours. How much more evidence do you need?" Agent Chen was monitoring multiple frequencies. "We've got movement at all 3 locations. Patterson is leaving her office. Walsh is gathering medical supplies, and your daughter and son-in-law are heading back toward your neighborhood." Dorothy made a decision that surprised even her. "I'm going home." "Absolutely not. They think I'm a confused old woman who signed papers yesterday and went home to wait for death. If I don't show up at my apartment, they'll know something's wrong." Jerome was shaking his head. "It's too dangerous. More dangerous than letting them kill other people because we didn't have enough evidence to stop this network." Dorothy was already reaching for the door handle. "Besides, I've got federal recording equipment, FBI surveillance, and 40 years of experience dealing with people who underestimate me because of my race and age." She looked at Jerome seriously. "Trust me to finish this." 2 hours later, Dorothy sat in her own living room waiting. She'd made tea, set out cookies, and arranged her afternoon medications on the kitchen counter exactly as any elderly person might do. She'd even called Keisha to report feeling unwell and asked if Dr. Walsh might be able to make a house call. The recording equipment was running. Surveillance teams were positioned throughout the building. And Dorothy Williams was ready to face the people who planned to kill her. The knock on her door came at exactly 4 o'clock. "Mrs. Williams, I'm Dr. Walsh. Your daughter asked me to check on you." Dorothy opened the door to find a middle-aged white woman carrying a medical bag and wearing the kind of professional smile that doctors used when delivering bad news. "Oh, how thoughtful of Keisha. Please come in." Dr. Walsh entered the apartment, her eyes quickly scanning the space, noting the medications on the counter, assessing Dorothy's apparent frailty. "Your daughter is very concerned about you. She mentioned that you've been having some confusion since signing those important papers yesterday." "I have been feeling foggy," Dorothy agreed, settling into her chair slowly. "And my blood pressure has been acting up." "Well, let's take a look at your medications. Sometimes adjustments are needed, especially after stressful events like legal proceedings." Dr. Walsh moved to the kitchen counter where Dorothy's pills were arranged. She pulled out a small vial from her medical bag and began examining the prescription bottles. "I see you're taking lisinopril for blood pressure. What dosage?" 10 milligrams twice daily." Dorothy watched as Dr. Walsh opened the prescription bottle and shook several pills into her palm. From her medical bag, she removed what looked like identical pills and began switching them out. "These are a slightly different formulation," Dr. Walsh explained. "They should help with the confusion you've been experiencing." Dorothy knew she was watching her own murder being prepared. Dr. Walsh was replacing her regular blood pressure medication with something designed to cause a fatal drop in blood pressure or heart rhythm irregularity. "How many should I take?" "Let's start with 3 tonight before bed, then 2 in the morning. The adjustment period can take a few days." Dr. Walsh was giving her enough medication to cause death within hours. "Doctor, I have a question." "Of course." Dorothy looked directly at Dr. Walsh, her voice losing all pretense of confusion. "How many elderly people have you killed with those pills?" Dr. Walsh froze pills still in her palm. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." "I think you understand perfectly. Just like you understood when you killed Mrs. Eleanor Jackson last month, and Mr. Robert Thompson before that, and Mrs. Sarah Bennett before that. Dorothy stood up, no longer moving, like a frail, elderly woman. You see, Dr. Walsh, while you've been planning my murder, I've been investigating yours. Dr. Walsh's professional mask slipped completely. She looked toward the door, calculating escape routes. Mrs. Williams, I think you're confused. The only thing I'm confused about is how you sleep at night knowing you've murdered at least 7 innocent people for money. That's when Dr. Walsh reached into her medical bag and pulled out a syringe. You should have just signed the papers and died quietly, she said, advancing toward Dorothy. You should have picked a target who didn't have FBI backup. The apartment door burst open as federal agents flooded in, weapons drawn. Dr. Walsh dropped the syringe, her hands automatically going up in surrender. Dr. Amanda Walsh, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. As agents cuffed Dr. Walsh and read her rights, Dorothy's phone rang. It was Keisha. Mama, Dr. Walsh said she was coming to see you. How did it go? Dorothy looked at the federal agents processing the crime scene in her living room at the switched medications that would have killed her at the syringe Dr. Walsh had been prepared to use as a backup method. It went exactly as planned, baby, exactly as planned. 6 months later, Dorothy Williams sat in a federal courthouse watching her daughter receive a sentence of 25 years for conspiracy to commit murder, elder financial abuse, and racketeering. Marcus got 20 years. Dr. Amanda Walsh received life without parole for 7 counts of murder. Gloria Patterson had flipped, providing evidence against 12 other families involved in the elder abuse network, in exchange for a reduced sentence of 15 years. Her testimony revealed an operation that had stolen over $50 million from elderly victims across 6 states. But the number that haunted Dorothy wasn't the money, it was 37. 37 elderly people murdered by this network over 5 years. 37 families destroyed by greed. 37 lives cut short so their relatives could inherit early. Mrs. Williams, the prosecutor assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Santos, approached Dorothy in the courthouse hallway. The judge would like to speak with you privately. Judge Catherine Morrison was a Black woman in her 60s who had presided over the entire trial with the kind of quiet authority Dorothy recognized from her own professional life. Mrs. Williams, I wanted to personally thank you for your courage in this case. Without your willingness to put yourself at risk, this network would still be operating. I did what anyone would do. No, Judge Morrison said firmly. You did what very few people have the strength to do. You trusted the system despite having every reason not to, and you risked your life to save others. Dorothy looked out the courthouse window at Boston Harbor, where ships carried people toward new lives, new opportunities, new chances at freedom. Judge Morrison, I need to ask you something. My granddaughter Aisha, she's 22, pre-med at Spelman. She wasn't directly involved in the conspiracy, but she knew something was happening and didn't speak up. What would you like me to consider? I'd like her to have a chance to learn from this, to understand what it means to protect vulnerable people instead of exploiting them. Judge Morrison nodded. Community service requirements can be very educational. 3 months later, Dorothy stood in the Union Baptist Community Center, addressing a packed room of elderly congregants, their families, and community advocates. She'd been invited to speak about elder financial abuse prevention, but her real message was about something more fundamental. The people who tried to kill me looked like me, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. They knew my history, my struggles, my community. They knew I'd survived Jim Crow and workplace discrimination and every other system designed to keep Black women powerless. The room was completely silent. They counted on our community's loyalty, our tradition of trusting family, our reluctance to involve outside authorities in our private business. They weaponized everything we've used to protect ourselves against us. Sister Clara Johnson nodded from the front row. But here's what they didn't count on. They didn't count on Sister Clara's network. They didn't count on Mrs. Rodriguez having my back. They didn't count on Agent Jerome Johnson being raised by a woman who taught him to respect his elders. They didn't count on a community that actually protects its own. Dorothy pulled out a folder of papers. I'm announcing today the Dorothy Williams Elder Protection Foundation. We're funding legal aid, financial counseling, and safety planning for elderly people in our community. We're training family members to recognize abuse, and we're creating a network so that no elder in our community faces threats alone. The applause was immediate and sustained. After the presentation, Dorothy found herself surrounded by people wanting to share their own stories, their own concerns, their own commitment to protecting vulnerable community members. Mrs. Williams, a young woman approached hesitantly. I'm Aisha. Dorothy looked at her granddaughter for the first time since the trial. Aisha had lost weight, looked older, carried herself with the kind of careful humility that came from real consequences. Grandmother, I know I don't have the right to ask for forgiveness. You're right. You don't have that right. Aisha nodded, tears in her eyes. But, Dorothy continued, you have the opportunity to earn it. What are you doing with your life now? I'm working with the Public Defender's Office helping elderly clients navigate the legal system. And I'm finishing pre-med, but now I want to specialize in geriatric care, real care, not what my parents planned. Dorothy studied her granddaughter's face, looking for signs of the character she'd hoped to see 20 years ago when Aisha was learning to walk in this same community center. The Dorothy Williams Foundation needs a youth coordinator, someone who understands both the medical side and the legal side of elder protection. Someone who knows what it looks like when these systems fail. Aisha's eyes widened. You would trust me with that. I would give you the chance to prove yourself trustworthy. There's a difference. 1 year after the trial, Dorothy Williams stood in her apartment. The same apartment she'd escaped through the fire escape. The same apartment where Dr. Walsh had tried to kill her, preparing for her weekly radio show. Good morning, this is Dorothy Williams with Elders Speaking Truth on WUMB Boston. Today, we're talking with families who've rebuilt trust after financial abuse, and we have some special guests in the studio. Jerome Johnson, now promoted to head the FBI's Elder Abuse Task Force, was her first guest. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose catering business had expanded into a community support network, was her second. And Aisha Williams Davis, coordinator of the Dorothy Williams Elder Protection Foundation, was her third. Let's start with this question, Dorothy said into the microphone. How do we balance protecting our elders with respecting their independence? As they talked, Dorothy looked around the studio at this unlikely group of allies. A federal agent who'd learned to trust community wisdom. A Latina entrepreneur who'd built safety nets across cultural lines. A young Black woman learning to use her privilege to protect rather than exploit. And Dorothy herself, 72 years old, sharper than ever, using her voice and her platform to make sure what happened to her never happened to anyone else. The settlement from the criminal restitution had been substantial, nearly $3 million recovered from the network's accounts. Dorothy had kept enough to secure her own future and donated the rest to organizations fighting elder abuse across the country. She still lived in the same apartment, still walked the same streets, still attended Union Baptist every Sunday. But now she did it as someone who had looked evil in the face, evil that wore her daughter's smile and spoke with her son-in-law's voice, and had chosen to fight rather than surrender. As the radio show ended and her guests prepared to leave, Aisha lingered. Grandmother, can I ask you something? Always. Do you think she ever really loved me, my mother? Dorothy considered the question seriously. I think she loved the idea of you, the version of you that would have carried on her plans without questioning them. But love that asks you to participate in murder isn't really love. Aisha nodded slowly. I think I'm learning what real love looks like. The kind that protects people instead of using them. That's the most important education you'll ever get. As Dorothy locked up the radio station and walked out into the Boston evening, she thought about legacy. Not the financial legacy Keisha had tried to steal, but the legacy of how you treat people when they're vulnerable. How you use power when you have it. how you choose community over individual gain. Tomorrow, she would visit Sister Clara, check on Mrs. Rodriguez's new community center project, review applications for the Foundation's Emergency Assistance Fund, and continue the daily work of making sure her community's elders were protected and valued. And tomorrow evening, she would sit in her favorite chair in her own apartment, financially secure and surrounded by people who had earned the right to be called family, knowing that she had transformed her near murder into a movement that would protect thousands of other elders. Dorothy Williams had survived more than an assassination attempt. She had survived the betrayal of discovering that the people who were supposed to love her most were willing to kill her for money. But she had also discovered something more powerful than family obligation or blood loyalty. She had discovered a community willing to fight for justice, a network of people committed to protecting the vulnerable, and her own capacity to transform betrayal into purpose. At 72, Dorothy Williams was just getting started.